Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing the album Wind and Wuthering by the band Genesis.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
Holy moly, yet another Genesis album. We've done a lot of those and we still have some left, and this is an album that I'm entirely new to, except for one singular track. Can you guess which one it is? Well, I'm not gonna tell you it right now, but I'll tell you later on in the video. Anyway, for now, here's some of my favorite bits from this album.
Think I might go out for a stroll into the night and out of this hole.
So we've come a long way this year, and especially with Genesis, one of, if not the most seminal band in the history of progressive rock. We started off the year checking out an album which basically marked the turning point from the proggy Genesis to the poppy Genesis in episode 15, where we talked about the album Duke, and then we moved on to a long hiatus before coming back into this band in episode 265 and reviewing A Trick of the Tail. And well, that album kinda already readied me for today's episode, seeing as it's the album that comes right before the album we're reviewing today. But just to let you all know, the last episode of the series will be discussing The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and if you're watching this episode when it comes out, then you'll still have to wait 27 days, but if you're watching this one anytime in 2023, the episode is out, it is amazing, and you should definitely go check it out. But today we're diving into Wind and Wuthering, the 8th studio album by the band Genesis. Now, just as a bit of recap for all of you guys, Genesis have started off with a pretty slow start, but then have propelled themselves over the course of about 5 years into being probably the biggest progressive rock band of all time. And well, after in 1975 their frontman Peter Gabriel left the band, these guys have somehow managed to soldier on and create A Trick of the Tail, and even create an amazing tour revolving around it, which cemented their place as them being a very strong band despite the departure of Gabriel. Now, sometime in mid-1976, the band found out that they could save a bunch of money if they just recorded outside of the UK, so they jumped on the idea and settled to record their next album in the Netherlands, specifically in Ilvarenbeek. And well, they went there in late 1976 and they did a recording session which only took around about 12 days. Now, as the 4 members of Genesis at the time came into the studio, they basically had all of the materials already ready and composed. Actually, they had a surplus of them, with most of the compositions being contributed by Tony Banks and Stephen Hackett. Now, guitarist Steve Hackett actually wrote most of these materials not to be used on Genesis, but instead to be used on his second solo album, which he wanted to produce before actually getting into yet another Genesis album, but both the management and the band denied his idea of doing so, so he basically had no option other to use these materials in the next Genesis album, or to just entirely forget about them. And well, he was not up for that, so he put up his materials for pick, and well, unfortunately most of them were not really chosen. You see, the way that Genesis basically decided which tracks would fit and go on the album was by a major favorite vote, so they just shared their own compositions and the band kinda talked about it and then voted on which tracks they wanted to appear on the album. And while most of the band, that being Mike Rutherford, Tony Banks, and of course Phil Collins, wanted this album to be a bit more down to earth and more realistic, Hackett came in with all these fantastical ideas ideas that were reminiscent of old Genesis, and well, these guys didn't really like those ideas too much. And as Hackett saw that most of his compositions were not getting on the album, he suggested yet another idea, doing some sort of a Yes is Fragile sort of thing, which basically means that each and every band member gets to compose 2 songs and then they combine them all together into one cohesive 8-track album, but that idea was scrapped and they just went ahead and put 6 of Tony Banks' compositions in comparison to only 3 Hackett compositions. In any case, as I said, most of the basic recordings for the tracks were laid down in the Netherlands and then they were further worked upon in the UK, and with another 3 weeks of remixing, the album was basically complete and ready for publishing. And so happened in late 1976 when the album was released under the title Wind and Wuthering, which was inspired by the book Wuthering Heights by Emily Burnett. Now, if there's one thing that I'm unfolding as I'm getting to listen to all of these mid-Genesis albums, is the fact that these guys never really had that turning point from becoming a pop band that used to be a prog band. It's amazing to listen to this discography with a trick of the tail, even the Lamb Lies Down on Broadway to some extent, and of course Wind and Wuthering. You just see how a band that was so progressive just slowly shifts their way into being the household pop rock band that everybody knows and loves. Now, I think that when it comes to actual prog on this album, there are really only 2 tracks that signify true progressiveness on here, and those would be In the Quiet Earth and One for the Vine, which is actually the track which I knew before getting into this one. And looking at the backstory of how this one was made, it's easy to see why this one is so progressive. This one was written solely by Banks, and he worked on it throughout the course of a single year until, as he quote, got it right. And well, this one just has a lot of musical ideas that were floating around in his head, and he wanted to fit them all together in a way that just works. And well, if that's not prog, then I don't know what is. And this is a story, an interesting one, that talks about a man who's basically declared to be this sort of Christ figure, but he doesn't believe it, but then he has to lead men into battle, and at the end of the story, of course, he finds out that he's always been the prophet that he never believed in. And it's a cool story, very reminiscent of old Genesis, which I personally really enjoy. Now, I would actually say that this one is my favorite track from the album, but seeing as I already knew it beforehand coming into this one, I feel like it's a bit of a cheat, so I chose another track as my favorite. Your Own Special Way is another interesting track from this album, because personally it was not really a favorite of mine. It actually didn't really do a lot with me, but apparently in the US crowd back at the time when this was released, these guys were drooling over it. So good actually that this one charted at the 62nd place in the US top billboards or something, so it was a big deal. Now, the last track on the A side is one that I have to mention. It's called What Gorilla, and it's written W-O-T Gorilla ? And this one is just an interesting one. It basically takes like one instrumental passage from One for the Vine and it just repeats it all around in a very jazz fusion-y way that was mainly inspired by Phil Collins' Brand X. And while Phil loved this one and the rest of the band were quite content with it, Hackett really didn't like how this one sounded, saying that it is quite redundant, again further distancing himself from the band. Now, All That Mouse's Night is also another one with a very interesting backstory to it. One thing is that this one is mainly based on Tom and Jerry, and you can hear it from the lyrics, and honestly, if it came down to the lyrics alone, this is downright my favorite track from the entire album. And this is one of those Steve Hackett compositions on the album, and at first this was supposed to be some sort of a romantical song, but then as he saw the direction that this album was taken, he just wanted to put out something that was basically satirical, laughing, or just mocking everything that this album was and how realistic it was. So he wrote this very satirical song, and well, Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford just absolutely loved it, stating that it was his best work with Genesis ever, which I might not agree with, but still, I think it's quite ironic. And the last 3 tracks on the album basically play out like one continuous epic, with the sandwich one in the middle being In That Quiet Earth is my favorite from the album. Now, that one is also quite interesting because unlike One for the Vine, which Tony Banks worked on for an entire year, this one he just said that it basically worked on it for the duration that it takes to play this song, which is Pretty funny if you ask me. But yeah, that's where this album ends, and the story itself ends with Steve Hackett just realizing that this isn't gonna work for him anymore, and he wanted to develop his own solo career. So after being a Genesis guitarist since 1970, he finally left the band after yet another successful tour in 1977. But from this point onwards, well, the story is already written. Genesis would go on to become one of the most popular ever pop rock bands, and leaving the progressive aspect aside. And well, while that might be a disappointment to a lot of fans, I still do think that it's interesting to see these albums in the mid-transition wave where they turned progressive into pop, and it definitely resulted in some really all-time classics. But as a whole, despite being content with getting to know this section of Genesis discography, I'm still quite angry at the fact that nobody recommended their debut album or Trespass on the list this year, because I've still never listened to them, and honestly, I really want to do so. But yeah, that's for this album. Now let's talk about its cover. Dare I say it? I think I will. Personally, I think that this is the finest cover in Genesis discography by a long shot. Now don't get me wrong, I love the rest of the Genesis covers, maybe not all of them, but the Paul Whitehead era, just lovely, so good. Foxtrot, Nursery Crime, best of the best. But this one, it's just amazing, at least in my personal opinion. This was made by Studio Hypnosis, and specifically by artist Colin LG, which he basically went over with the band, listened to the album, and he also knew Wuthering Heights, and he took inspiration both from that book and the film The Warlord to create this watercolor painting that took him about 3 weeks to make. Now, LG would actually go on to reflect on this cover, stating that it maybe needs a bit more color in his taste, but honestly, I think that the lack of color is what makes it. You know, there's The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, which was so, like, monumental because it didn't contain any color in a band's discography that were known for very colorful albums. But I don't think that the execution on that one is quite the same as this one, which seems to be intentionally dull with life, and you have these, orange leaves at the top, and they are so subtle, yet they add so much to this one, and the painting itself is just so beautiful, I can't stop looking at it. And I'll share with you something. So when I end this series, I still want to make videos on this channel that are prog related, and I have this idea of creating a album cover based series that I'm gonna do on here. I already have some ideas for that, and I think that maybe if I do something like that, I'm gonna try my hand out at painting a similar cover like this. So all in all, this album is swell, and thus it's gonna get a very swellfully rating, which will be a 7 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're gonna be listening to Hope by Klaatu. Yes. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wan, Arist of Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best. And if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my About page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.